How's everyone doing? Good. First of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to join and celebrate 30 years with you. Congratulations, first and foremost. There is not much in public health that makes it to 30 years, so that in and of itself is really impressive. Second of all, thank you for the warm welcome. Let me express how wonderful it is to be home in Maine. Thank you. I only have an hour and a half to speak, and so let's get right down to it. What I'd like to do this evening is talk a little bit about where we are in this moment in public health. And I'm going to do so sort of by talking about some of the threats that we're facing, some of the opportunities, but then, and critically and most importantly, what it all means for you. I'm hoping I can reserve a little bit of time at the end for some Q&A and discussion. But let's get right to it. Right now, we are facing a number of threats across the enterprise of public health. And I'm going to talk about those, but as I do, I want to be clear, this is not meant to be an exhaustive list. But it is a sense of, in my mind, what are the principal threats that we're facing across the country, really across the globe, right now in public health. And somewhat based on the work that I did at the CDC, which focused on outbreak response and pandemic preparedness and such, it's no surprise that the number one of these threats on my list are ecological risks. These have been with us for time immemorial, but they are more pressing now in this particular moment. And when I'm talking about ecological risks, I'm largely focused on the risks of infectious disease outbreaks and pandemics. But I don't mean to exclude other ecological and environmental risks as well, whether it's lead poisoning, PFAS, wildfire smoke, etc. But top of mind for me remains the risks that are posed by novel or upsurging infectious diseases. Now, many of you are aware of the forces and factors that are leading to that, whether it's greater convergence of animals and humans, particularly in places in the world where those things are more likely to happen, but whether it's increased crowding in many cities in the world, or the threats posed by climate change, which are accelerating migration, causing widespread displacements and migrations because of a search for food, water, etc. All of these things are heightening the ecological risks that we face in the United States. What that translates to very concretely is an increased risk of the next pandemic. I don't know when it will happen, I don't know where it will happen, but I do know that it will happen. And as we'll talk about in the threats section even more in detail, some of the concerns that we have right now are the ways in which the architecture that is used to detect, respond, and ultimately prevent some of these pandemics is being eroded. Which takes me to my second threat right now, which are threats that are based on financing and governance. I don't have to tell all of you that right now, from a fiscal as well as a governance matter, public health is under threat. Now, the optimist in me, perhaps Pollyannish, is saying that public health has always been under threat. Can any of you remember a time when we were flush with cash? That wasn't a national emergency? No. So in one sense, it's the nature of the beast that public health funding ebbs and flows. But right now, we are in a period where the pendulum is swinging away. More than that, though, we're also in a period where the governance structures of public health are very much under attack. Certainly at the US CDC, but elsewhere. We're going to talk in a bit about what the implications of that are and what you all can be doing to act as a ballast against those threats. The third risk I want to detail is psychological risk. Here's what I mean by that. One of the interesting findings in the aftermath of the 1918 pandemic was a collective amnesia that ensued for the years after the pandemic had been brought under control. If you look back in history, there were startling advances in American public health and American medicine, hospitals being built, institutions, large-scale research projects in public health, sanitation, etc., that were all built starting around 1925. But from the period 1919, 1920 to 1925, very, very little happened. Not nothing, but very little. And many historians ascribe this to a collective amnesia. And I suspect that we are in a similar phase right now. How many of you that are focused on the next pandemic, or even the current pandemic, because COVID is still with us, how many of you have found it difficult to galvanize your friends, family, and neighbors to think about or talk about those things right now? No one wants to talk about it. Now, not only is that a psychological phenomenon, it has implications for our readiness and for our preparedness. Indeed, as I was leaving the US CDC, we were battling an upsurge in avian influenza, which still has not really receded, maybe in a bit of a lull period, but it is sure to return. To say nothing of viral hemorrhagic fever outbreaks of Ebola in Uganda, Marburg virus in Tanzania, Mpox in the DRC and elsewhere, just to name a few that I had to deal with on my very last day at the agency a couple of weeks ago. The psychological amnesia, or the psychological risk, means that if something were to materialize now, we would have, in addition to the biological challenges, a psychological challenge in galvanizing people toward action. And that in and of itself is a problem. It dovetails with the next risk I want to talk about, which is an informational risk. That is just a word that I use because I wanted the rest of the words to all end in AL. But what I really mean is the risk of misinformation. That risk, as you all know very well, has never been more pronounced. And indeed, it's becoming more pernicious as we think about fractioning and segmentation of society, to say nothing of the threats that are posed by artificial intelligence as it relates to being able to generate vast amounts of misinformation online, so on and so forth. There's not much more to be said about that, but we will come back to what we can do about it in a bit. And finally, the last risk I want to spend a moment talking about is educational, which again is just a label that I put on that because what I really want to talk about is workforce, but I wanted the rest of the list to sound good. And so workforce risks are more pronounced now than ever. Indeed, that is one reason I'm so excited to be up at Colby starting in the fall, at least for a year, to start thinking about ways we can improve the pipeline to public health. We talk a good game in public health about the next generation of workers, so on and so forth. And we in Maine do comparatively a lot better than other places in the country in getting the next generation of public health workers in place, but there is so much more that we can be doing. And this is, again, in the aftermath of COVID, a significant risk. I'm not going to go through all the data because you all know it very well. The public health workers are leaving the field and have left the field in droves. That is only going to get magnified if the governance and financial risks that I noted earlier continue. At the same time, there is hope on the horizon here. Becca and I, where's Becca? Oh, there's Becca. Becca and I were just talking a moment ago, kind of marveling at the fact that undergraduates are really excited to go into public health. Great. Sounds good. You read the paper? But great, sounds great. So at the same time, there are risks in front of us. There's also enthusiasm. And the opportunity for Maine is to harness that enthusiasm and make sure that we can actually train the next generation of public health workforce. So that's a handful of risks that are facing us. Ecological, financial and governance, psychological, informational, and educational. Sounds pretty good. What are we going to do about that? I mean, that's ultimately the question. And how do we approach these risks? How do we contend with them in this particular moment? Not just on a national level, although I know many of you are involved in advocacy at the national level through different organizations. I mean here at the local level. What are the best ways, again, to serve as a ballast against these forces which could undermine our entire enterprise and leave us less prepared for the next pandemic? And so, although what I outlined sounds a bit dark, I do ultimately want to focus on a bright and optimistic future. Because make no mistake, the arc of public health is long. And no matter what happens for the next 3 years and 7 months, public health will continue onward. And so I caution us right at the top against taking an overly myopic or short-term view. The long-term view is still the one that must prevail, because public health, again, is an enterprise that just can't disappear. And I'm going to say this now, and I'm going to say it at the end. Local public health of the sort that Healthy Androscoggin conducts cannot go away, no matter what our timeline is. So let's talk about some opportunities, strategies for engagement in this particular moment. The one that comes top of mind is the importance now more than ever of telling our story. Where's Dave? There's Dave, right back there. Dave came up to me earlier and shared 2 stories with me. One about himself and one about a woman that he'd worked with. A woman who had been administered Narcan 27 times. But on the 28th time, she decided it was time to get help. And that woman is still with us today, right, Dave?
Yep.
She works with the homeless population, right?
Yep. She volunteers, she goes into the camps, bringing supplies.
How many people across the state of Maine, if asked to talk about the successes of our work collectively across the state around opioid and substance use, how many people would know that story, David? You've talked about it publicly, right?
I've done it quite a bit publicly.
Yep.
At colleges and on commercials, Facebook. But when I was telling those stories, she hadn't started volunteering yet. I knew that she was alive. I knew that she had an overdose again in 3.5 years. But this summer at the Rally for Recovery, when she came up to me and asked for help, to help other people, and asked for supplies, I had tears in my eyes. I mean, this is the person that we thought we'd never see again.
Well, Dave, I was so pleased and thankful that you shared that story with me, because candidly, I hadn't heard it. And I'm glad that it's out there, but it's an example of exactly the kind of storytelling that is crucial at this moment. Everyone in Maine who wants to know how we're doing with respect to substance use should be able to say, well, you know, here's an example, because that is the kind of thing that changes minds. Now, as someone who likes science, going to be teaching a lot of math classes, we all like to think in our field that data and numbers are what changes minds. They really don't. They can help. But what ultimately changes minds is not logic, it's emotion, it's a story. And we've always had an imperative in public health to tell stories. That imperative is more important now than it has ever been. There is a deep degree of skepticism toward numbers and data and science at the federal level. Those who you may share those numbers with will question the origins of them. They will question whether you were biased in your collection of them, whether you are spinning them in a certain way or not. But a story, a vivid story, is something that's very difficult to call into question. And so now, more than ever, the number one thing we can be doing to work in our field, to galvanize support, let alone funding, is to tell our story, particularly our successes. Now, there are a lot of different ways that we can do this. There's already manuals out there on this. The De Beaumont Foundation has a book called Talking Health. If you don't have it, you can be very easy to get. Someone's reaching into their bag. I bet you have a copy. No. That would have been beautiful if you had that. That's a great book. Many years ago, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation put out a report on how to talk about the social determinants of health. Bottom line, don't use the phrase social determinants of health. Now it's more important than ever to tell the stories. Of course, doing so entails finding the stories. But you all within this room already have the stories. Right, Dave? You already got the stories. Now it's a matter of telling them in a way that can galvanize people toward action. Not just our friends and supporters, but also our skeptics. People can argue with data, they can say you're spinning the numbers, but they can't argue with the story. So number one, above all else, now is the time to tell our stories. It doesn't stop there. Make no mistake, we are facing a high degree of skepticism in public health. Just about 2 weeks ago, a well-known researcher at the Harvard School of Public Health named Jillian Steelfisher, she specializes in polling people on their sentiments around public health. She released the latest of her string of polls, getting the pulse check on how people across the country are thinking about public health. Now, the top lines from her latest survey data could be read to be of concern. I acknowledge that. What she found is that net of net, more people will lose trust in public health than will gain trust, given the current leadership at the federal level. About 44% of people will lose trust, and I think think it was about 20 or so%, will actually gain trust. So net of net, a loss. So top line right there, not great. However, even within those survey data, there were glimmers of hope. And I urge folks to take a look at it. It's on the Chan School's website. But what I want to focus on is an interesting finding from her latest survey, which was asking people, both Republicans and Democrats, what are the areas in which they feel are the highest degree of overlap with folks on the other side of issues. And the list was long. There were 10 to 12 items on that list where 80, 90% of people on both sides of the spectrum believed that they thought were top priorities in public health. Food safety and nutrition, chronic disease, environmental contamination, toxicology, a number of these areas that are local issues scored extremely high on both fronts. Now, of course, there were a lot of things that I also think are important that didn't make the crossover list. Vaccinations, so on and so forth. But nevertheless, there was enough there on the list of overlap to keep Healthy Androscoggin busy for the next 30 years. I urge folks to take a look at that list of crossover because that will be a possible area of action. Now, make no mistake, there are going to be rescissions of funding, unfortunately. And now is the time to steel yourself for the possibility, the probability, that programs that you love may be paused or scrapped. It breaks my heart to say that, but I wouldn't be doing my job if I showed up and told you that everything was going to be roses. I think you all know that, but I think it's important to start reckoning with that fact and start planning around it. That's going to be tough, particularly here in Lewiston, Auburn. The other piece that is important to note is don't look for a theory. Don't look for a unifying principle that unites all of the moves that are being made. We sometimes think that there's a grand plan, but unfortunately in this day and age, in this moment, there isn't one. And so on one hand, Secretary Kennedy may really talk about the threats that are posed by lead poisoning. At the same time, he fires all of the people at the CDC who do lead poisoning prevention. He may talk a lot about the threat posed by PFAS. At the same time, he scuttles that work at CDC. At the same time, the EPA rolls back the MCL levels for at least 4 of the 7 PFAS compounds. It seems like it's at odds with one another, and it is. Now, you can try to reconcile it. I urge you not to waste time trying to do that. There isn't really a unifying theory. That's unfortunate because it means that a lot of the work you do has to be reactive rather than strategic and proactive. I wish it weren't so, but this is where we are. And the best way to contend with it is to make sure you're in a posture to react and that you've got stories at the ready. The next way to contend with things right now is, and again, I don't say this with any glee, but I wouldn't be doing my job, I wouldn't be talking straight to you if I did this. There's a lot of disdain right now for process. A lot of the moves that have been made, at least partially, can be explained by some degree of disdain for process-heavy procedures. That's for process. A lot of the moves suggest an emphasis on getting rid of a lot of processes, multiple opportunities to weigh in, comment, so on and so forth, and getting right to the action. Again, for many of us in public health that built our careers on inclusivity, that is disconcerting. But what it's being replaced by is something where I think there's opportunity, which is a focus de-emphasizing process, but emphasizing outcomes. And so, even though I said a moment ago, stories are what matter, outcomes matter just as much. And so for the work that each of you does, and then collectively that all of you do, someone should be able to walk into your room and shake you awake at night and say, what are your top 3 outcome metrics for the past 3 months? And you should be able to say without equivocation the top 3 things that you've moved the needle on. Outcomes are going to be so much more important in a manner that process may have been previously. Outcomes will be the focus going forward. And then finally, 2 things on the advocacy front. The first is the need for an aggressive pushback on misinformation. We cannot let that slide. If and when you see misinformation in your household, in your neighborhood, in your community, on Facebook, wherever, now is the time to push back. Because if it is left to fester, it will solidify. The foundation will harden, and it will be impossible to break through. And so pushing back on misinformation is more important now than it ever has been. Likewise is advocacy, which is more important now than it ever has been. There are already, in the first 4 months of the administration, numerous examples of policies that were announced and then pulled back upon after widespread outrage and pushback. Now, you can't swing at every pitch, so we have to be judicious about the arenas in which we push back. But pushback can be effective if used strategically and if used judiciously when it really, truly matters. The corollary of that is that all hope is not lost. Advocacy still matters. We just have to be strategic about where to deploy it. And finally, and most important, what I want to close on is the importance of local action. Just what Healthy Androscoggin does. The successes that you all have had in the years that I've been in Maine, reaching back even further than that, are too numerous to count. I mean, I've already referenced lead poisoning. Lead poisoning rates here in Lewiston, Auburn, are 4-fold lower than what they were just a few years ago. Half of the kids have a much the percentage of kids in the cohort who have tested above 5 is down by 50%, thanks to the work that you all do. Likewise, on areas such as disaster behavioral health, you all have pivoted numerous times when new grant monies come in to make sure that services in the midst of a disaster are available to people who need them. And who can forget the vaccine clinic at the Auburn Mall, which you all had a major role in. Every single person here, including Kristen McCauley, really helped me get it going, had a role in making that a reality. Local action is more important now than it ever has been. Again, you all are the ones that are doing the work, but now I need you to collect and tell those stories. There's a bit of a dark cloud over public health right now, as I've referenced. But again, how many people across Maine know the good work, the successes that have happened? We have this thing in public health where we don't like to talk about our wins. Sociologists can talk about why, or anthropologists can talk about why. But we need to do that more. And the progress that's been made around lead poisoning, the progress that's been made with respect to opioid and substance use disorder reversals, those stories can and must be told. Because here's the thing, no matter the forces that are coming our way, local public health can't go away. We simply can't function in a world where restaurants serve rotten food and purveyors sell milk that's spoiled and caterers go to work with typhoid fever. We're not going to go back to 1905. That's not the world we are going to live in, which means that the work that each and every one of you does is more important now than it ever has been. So I urge you to keep your head up, to go out there and tell your stories, and keep doing the work that you're doing. Thank you all so much for the opportunity to join you this evening. I'm going to take a sip of this clear liquid. Not quite sure what it is, but thank you all so much. Very much appreciated. Thank you. Oh, ooh, thank you. I'm not a government employee now, so I can wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. He did promise questions and answers.
Yes, I got time for it.
We do have a couple minutes
Let's
if you
do
would
it.
like to do
Let's
that.
do it. I'm so sorry. Yes. I was about to hit the road with my gift. I'm going to go back and have a cigarette. But yeah, questions? Yes.
You mentioned outcomes and storytelling.
Yes.
Do you think it's important to illustrate outcomes through storytelling so it's not so heavy on the data?
Yeah, I really do. I mean, that's the ideal unison of both of those approaches, which is of course, to personalize it, as the exchange that Dave and I had. So it brings a face to the problem, but then ultimately a story that ideally has a good outcome, that is representative of the broader impact. So lead poisoning substance use speaks for itself. Lead poisoning is another good one as well, where the number of families whose children were not affected, or families who had been helped, that's such a vivid way to demonstrate the broader outcomes that you've seen, but to personalize them at the very, very real level. Those stories are really critical. Now, I say things like that, and people say, oh, the lead poisoning story, it's been told. There's nothing new under the sun there. I don't believe that for a second. I mean, have you told the story of the inspector who goes in and does the inspection? Have you told the story of the social worker who counsels a family that's terrified that their child may have a neurological deficit? Have you told the story of the lab technician who spends his or her day taking these blood samples and how he or she thinks about what that means? All of those stories are still waiting to be told. So. Other questions? Yes, yeah, Steve, thank you. Thank you
I've
for
always
being
wanted to
here.
ask you this question, so I'm glad I'm here tonight. So Maine is a little bit unique in that it lacks a public local health department infrastructure. To what extent is that a risk or an opportunity for us today?
I don't know the answer. I mean, I know that, by which I mean, I know that's a discussion that preceded my arrival, and I will suspect continue onward after I'm off of this earth. I don't know, frankly, whether the transaction costs of standing up that infrastructure, let alone getting buy-in at the local county level for that sort of tax, whether all of that will solve a problem. If we were to redraw the world or redraw Maine from scratch, I think that would be the right place to start. But whether in this particular moment, with the infrastructure we have, with Healthy Androscoggin and analogous organizations, whether the transaction costs of then going from where we are to erecting that county level health department infrastructure, I'm not convinced that it would be worth it. That's probably a heretical thing to say in a lot of places, and it may get me excommunicated from public health in Maine. But that's my sense right now. I don't see across the country a lot of interest or enthusiasm for setting up county health departments. And so, again, if we were to redraw the world, might that be where we start? Perhaps. But is it worth trying to get there from here? Given the strong infrastructure, 30 years of successes and community buy-in, not convinced. Not convinced. Okay. So, yep. One last question. Yes?
It's a bigger, deeper one, but I don't really know the answer, and I think you might. Is what is the real resistance to some type of universal health care scenario in all of this?
I don't know. That you're right. It is a bigger, and I'm going to repeat the question. I forgot that we had folks. The question is, what is the resistance to some sort of universal health care in the current moment? I could list off some of the policy arguments that have been put forth, but those are shifting. And I will note that even yesterday, Secretary Kennedy, when he testified as to the HHS FY26 budget, was asked this question, I believe, by Senator Sanders. But in any event, and his answer was notable for its evasion, by which I mean, by which I really mean, he didn't just say, no, that's an insane idea, which I think others in his cohort or party might have done. He was noticeably, equivocal on the idea. That said, so I don't know in this particular moment what the aversion is, and indeed it's difficult for me to envision making America healthy again without some degree of broader access to healthcare. What I will say are two things. Secretary Kennedy and some of his counterparts, Secretary Rollins at USDA, et cetera, had an op-ed in the New York Times 2 days ago where they outlined their theory of Medicaid work requirements. I urge you to take a look at it. We would all have commentary on it. I won't comment on it here, but they outlined some of their thinking around it. And that sheds a little bit of light on the issue, but I have not heard the secretary engage in that debate directly, so I don't want to put any words in his mouth. But that New York Times op-ed at least shed light on their theories with respect to Medicaid and work requirements. To be candid, which is a weird thing to say, I'm just trying to be candid, the justice, in addition to the concerns around universal health access, the broader concerns that are right now happening at the congressional level around the Medicaid budget and the billions of dollars in cuts and what that would mean for the state level, those are something we should all be paying attention to. Okay, thank you all so much for the opportunity to